These days, people love to say that family is everything, that no matter how hard the world gets, your home will shelter you. But I learned the hard way that sometimes the place you call home is the very place that ruins you. Maybe you'll think I'm bitter or ungrateful when you hear my story. But I'm not telling it to make anyone pity me. I'm telling it because some truths need no one's approval to exist. And if you're sitting there, maybe on your couch with your phone in hand, listening before bed, I want you to ask yourself, do you really know what darkness can grow behind a closed door? Hello to everyone tuning in to Raging Tales tonight. Thank you for spending these moments here with me. If this story touches you or makes you feel less alone, please subscribe and share it. Now, I invite you to walk with me through the memories that still keep me awake, even after 75 years. My name is Clara Mayfield. I was born in a little town hidden deep among the folds of the Appalachians. When I was small, I thought it was the loveliest place in the world. The red clay roads that led past fields of corn, the sagging porches where neighbors swapped stories, the wooden fences bleached gray by the seasons. But when my foster mother died, every bit of that sweetness drained away. Our small timber house grew heavier each day, as if it knew it was meant to hold sorrow more than anything else. I can't remember exactly when my foster father first rested his hand on my shoulder in a way that made my skin crawl. Maybe it was just a harmless gesture, if it hadn't been for the way he looked at me like a man watching something he felt entitled to claim. To everyone else, he was respected. He spoke in a soft voice, tipped his hat to every passerby, and sat straight in the pew every Sunday. Folks called him patient and generous. Whenever I heard them praise him, I felt sick. After the funeral, the house sank into a silence so dense I could almost taste it. I would sit on the steps at dusk, clutching the handkerchief my foster mother had left behind, and watch the sun melt down the hills. The wind would rise and moan through the trees like some restless spirit. I would pretend if I stayed very still, she might return and tell me none of it was real. But no dream can stay long enough to spare you from the truth. I was 13 the winter everything began. It was so cold that year the water in the barrels froze solid. My foster father said it would be better if I slept in the main bedroom to stay warm. I was naive enough to believe he was worried about me. That night, I lay curled up near the edge of the big bed, the quilt pulled to my chin. I remember the sound of him closing the door, then his heavy steps crossing the room. Before I could ask why he was still awake, his hand yanked the blanket away. When dawn came, I was lying flat on the mattress that smelled of whiskey and cold ash. My thoughts were numb as if my head had been stuffed with cotton. All I could feel was that something precious inside me had been stolen and would never come back. In a small town like Old Hollow, bruises and hollow eyes don't stay hidden long. But people will always find reasons to believe whatever comforts them most. They said I must be sickly, that grief had made me delicate. Whenever neighbors came by, he would place his hand on my back and say in that soft voice that I just needed time to heal. I sat silent, swallowing every scream I had. Spring returned, but I wasn't allowed back at school. He told me a girl my age should be learning how to keep house instead of wasting time on books. I watched him burn my notebooks in the wood stove, smoke curling into the rafters. I felt like I was watching not just my lessons but part of myself turning to ash. When I turned 14 that May, the nights repeated themselves like some unholy ritual. I stopped crying. Instead, I would lie still, tracing the cracks in the ceiling boards. My body learned how to survive the pain, but my mind kept splitting further apart. One afternoon, I sat on the porch, clutching the handkerchief like a talisman. Mrs. Porter, our elderly neighbor, came by to leave a bundle of fresh beans. She looked at me longer than usual, her gaze gentle but searching. I think she knew. I think she suspected more than she could bear to ask. And in that town, everyone believed what happened behind your door was your own business. Time oozed past like slow syrup. I stopped measuring days by the calendar. All that mattered was keeping still enough to be left alone. Until that autumn, when a stranger appeared and cracked the door I thought would never open again. A young man whose kindness showed me there might be more to life than the walls of that suffocating house. You're listening to my story on Raging Tales. If you're still here, leave a comment to let me know you're listening. It helps more than you can imagine to know I'm not alone in these memories. I suppose you might imagine that when someone kind steps into your life, everything changes in a heartbeat, But kindness doesn't erase fear. It only shows you, for a moment, what it feels like to breathe without dread pressing on your ribs. The first time I saw Eli was on an afternoon so bright it made my eyes water. I had slipped out to the yard, pretending to sweep the porch, though really I just wanted a moment under the open sky. My foster father was gone to town, and for the first time in weeks, the air felt lighter. I heard a truck engine rumble up the road. A young man climbed down, wiping his hands on his trousers. He looked around as if unsure where to knock. His hair was sun-bleached, and when he lifted his gaze to me, he smiled in a way that made my heart flutter and my stomach twist with alarm. No one ever smiled at me like that anymore. He asked if this was the Mayfield house. I nodded, my voice stuck somewhere between my chest and my throat. He said he was here to fix the roof before the snow came, that Mrs. Porter had told him the shingles were rotting. I just pointed to the ladder leaning against the side of the porch and stepped back. For the next hour, I pretended to sweep and tidy as he moved across the roof, hammer tapping steady as a clock. Every few minutes, I risked a glance up. Sometimes he caught me looking, and I'd snap my head away, cheeks burning. But he never looked away in pity. There was nothing in his eyes but calm, plain kindness. When he finished, he climbed down and walked over to where I stood by the steps. He said the job was done, the roof wouldn't leak another winter. Then he hesitated, glancing around like he meant to ask something. "You all right, miss? You seem tired." His voice was gentle, almost uncertain. My heart began thumping so hard I thought he could see it through my dress. All I could manage was a shrug. Before he left, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a little hair clip. It was nothing fancy, just a tin butterfly painted pale blue. "I thought you might like this," he said, holding it out like an offering. My hand shook when I took it. "Thank you," I whispered, and for the first time in so long, I felt something warm bloom in my chest. The truck drove away, the dust settling back onto the road. I stood there a long while, turning that clip over in my fingers. I didn't put it in my hair. I tucked it deep in my apron pocket, as if hiding it might keep it safe. That evening, when my foster father returned, I tried to look as small and busy as possible. He smelled like tobacco, and the cheap whiskey he favored. He dropped his hat on the table and eyed me in a way that made the skin between my shoulder blades crawl. "Who was that out here today?" he asked, voice slow and sticky. My throat went dry. "Just the man fixing the roof," I said, praying he'd lose interest. "You talked to him?" His eyes pinned me in place. I kept folding the dish rag in my hands, pretending I hadn't heard. "I asked you a question." "A little," I said finally, "about the roof." He nodded once but didn't look satisfied. His silence was more dangerous than any rage. I felt it hanging over me like a storm waiting to break. After supper, he sat on the porch in his chair, staring at the road until darkness swallowed everything. I stayed inside, back pressed to the kitchen wall, listening to the creak of that chair rocking in the gloom. I wondered if he was thinking about my mother. I wondered if he thought about anything at all. When night came, I lay awake on my pallet in the corner, turning the little clip over and over in my palm. It was just a trinket. But holding it made me feel something I hadn't felt in so long I almost didn't recognize Ethope, a tiny flicker, like a spark in wet wood. The next morning, Mrs. Porter knocked on our door, claiming she needed to borrow flour. She stepped into the kitchen, eyes flicking from my face to the floor, where the hem of my dress was stained with soot. "You holding up, dear?" she asked softly when my foster father stepped out back. I wanted to tell her everything. My tongue pressed against my teeth, words rising up. But the memory of my father's hand on my throat smothered them. I just nodded. "If you ever need anything," she said, her palm warm on my arm, "you know where I am." When she left, the kitchen felt colder. I poured water into the basin and scrubbed the soot from my dress, wondering what it would feel like to say the truth out loud. That night, he didn't come to my pallet. He stayed in the bedroom, door shut. I lay awake, staring at the dark and thinking about Eli's face, the way he'd looked at me without suspicion. I let my mind drift to the thought that maybe, one day, I might leave this place. Maybe I would walk past the edge of town and never look back. It was a dangerous thought, but it was the only one that made my heart beat like it was still alive. I didn't know then that thoughts like that were seeds, and even in the darkest soil, a seed waits for the right moment to grow. Days drifted by, each one heavy with a hush that settled over the house like a burial cloth. My foster father spoke little, but the quiet carried more threat than any shouted words. I moved through the rooms as if I might vanish if I stayed too long in any one place. In the mornings, I swept and scrubbed until my hands ached, trying to scrub my thoughts clean too. But at night, when the darkness closed in, I would reach under my pillow and touch the little butterfly clip. I never dared wear it. I only held it, tracing the edges with my fingertip, reminding myself that kindness still existed somewhere beyond these walls. One evening, just as the last light sank behind the hills, I was carrying firewood to the stove when I heard the sound of footsteps outside. My breath caught. I moved to the window and saw Eli's truck parked by the fence. My heart jumped, but I stayed hidden behind the curtain. After a moment, he walked up the path, carrying a small sack. He knocked once, his knuckles brushing the door like he didn't want to disturb too much. My foster father came from the back porch, wiping his hands on his trousers. They spoke quietly, their words blurred by the distance, but I caught a few scraps. Mrs. Porter needed more work done. Before the frost, I stayed still as a stone, straining to hear. My father's voice was low and wary, but Eli only nodded, never raising his tone. At last, he turned to leave, but before he reached the truck, he glanced back at the window. For an instant, our eyes met through the glass. I don't know what he saw in my face, fear, maybe, or a plea I didn't dare speak, but he didn't look away until the truck door shut between us. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay on my pallet with the thin quilt pulled up to my chin, listening to every creak and sigh of the house. My thoughts circled the same question over and over. Why had Eli come back? Was it just work, or did he suspect what lay behind our closed doors? By morning, the question was still lodged in my chest like a splinter. My foster father seemed restless, pacing the kitchen, starting and abandoning chores. When I brought him his coffee, his eyes flicked over me, lingering too long. I felt the air thin around us. "You remember your place," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from the cup. "No one needs to be poking their nose here." I nodded without lifting my eyes. My hands trembled so badly the coffee sloshed over the rim. He didn't say more. He didn't have to. Later that afternoon, I walked out to the yard to shake the rugs. The air was cold enough to sting my cheeks. Across the way, Mrs. Porter was standing near her fence, her scarf tied snug under her chin. When she saw me, she lifted one hand in greeting. I hesitated, then took a step closer. "Child," she called softly, her voice carried by the wind. "If you ever need help, you must let me know." I swallowed hard. My throat burned with words I couldn't risk. She watched me, her eyes kind but edged with worry. I opened my mouth, but no sound came. I only nodded once, quickly, and turned away before my resolve cracked. Inside, the house felt smaller than before. Every corner seemed to watch me. That night, I dreamed I was running barefoot across an endless field. The sky overhead was so wide it felt like it would swallow me. But no matter how far I ran, the house was always just behind me, its windows glowing with a cold light. I woke with tears dried on my cheeks. For the first time, I understood that no one was coming to rescue me unless I found the courage to reach for escape myself. The thought settled heavy in my bones, but underneath it was something else, a thin, sharp thread of determination. The next morning, when my foster father left for town, I slipped across the yard to Mrs. Porter's gate. She was tending her chickens, but when she saw me, she straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice so small I barely recognized it. She led me inside without a word. The kitchen smelled of baking bread and wood smoke. It was warmer than any place I'd been in months. She poured me tea I could hardly swallow and waited while I tried to find my voice. I began, but the words tangled. My fingers picked at the seam of my skirt. "I think he'll kill me if I stay." Mrs. Porter didn't look surprised. She reached across the table and laid her hand over mine, her skin lined and warm. "Then we won't let that happen," she said. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that any of this could be different. That afternoon, as I slipped back into the gray house, Something shifted inside me. A question I'd never dared ask. What if there was more to living than just surviving? As the door closed behind me, I pressed the little clip into my palm and let myself imagine I'd a life where no one owned me, where my name meant only myself. I didn't know it yet, but that day was the start of everything. The moment the seed began to push up through the dark, reaching for any scrap of light. After that morning in Mrs. Porter's kitchen, the days began to feel different. Not easier, never that, but altered in a way I couldn't fully name. It was as if a tiny crack had opened in the walls I'd built around myself, letting in a draft of something close to hope. I tried not to think too much about what might come next. Hope was a dangerous thing in a place like that. If it grew too big, it could get you killed. So I tucked it away like the butterfly clip, hidden but close to my heart. I returned to my chores with new caution. Every time I swept the floor or stirred the pot on the stove, I wondered if my foster father could sense the shift in me. Sometimes, when he walked past, I felt his eyes on my back, searching for any sign I might be plotting something he couldn't control. One evening, as the last light faded and the lamps began to glow, he came in earlier than usual. He didn't speak. He just sat at the kitchen table, watching me set out supper. The silence stretched until I thought I might choke on it. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I hear you've been talking to Mrs. Porter more than you ought to," he said. My hand stilled on the loaf of bread. I kept my gaze on the counter, afraid that if I met his eyes, he'd see every secret I was holding. "She's a lonely old woman," I whispered. "She likes company." He made a sound I couldn't decipher. When I dared to look up, his face was unreadable. "Just remember who feeds you," he said, "and who took you in when no one else would." I nodded. My stomach turned, though I hadn't eaten a bite. He didn't say more, but that night, he locked the front door. With a key he slipped into his pocket. The next morning, I woke before dawn. For a long time, I lay staring at the ceiling, the cold air seeping through the gaps in the walls. My thoughts were a tangled skein. Part of me was certain I should forget escape, pretend nothing had changed. But another part, smaller but louder, kept whispering that I had already crossed a line inside myself. There was no going back to the girl who never hoped for more. When the sun came up, I gathered my courage like a threadbare shawl and went about my chores. I swept the porch, fed the chickens, hauled water from the well. All the while, I rehearsed in my head what I would tell Mrs. Porter the next time I saw her. By afternoon, my foster father announced he'd be going to the sawmill for supplies. As soon as I heard the truck rattle down the road, I hurried across the yard, heart hammering so hard it made my ears buzz. Mrs. Porter was out by her garden, pruning the dead stems of her roses. When she saw me, she didn't smile, just nodded, as if she'd been expecting me. Inside, the kitchen was warm and smelled of apples cooking down into butter. She poured me tea without a word, waiting until I sat. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. "I don't know how to do this," I said finally. My voice sounded small in the hush. "Do what, child?" "Leave," I whispered. "Run." Mrs. Porter set down her cup. Her lined face was steady, though her eyes glistened a little. "You don't have to know how," she said. "You just have to decide you will." We sat in the quiet. My chest ached with so many things: fear, shame, a longing so big it hurt to hold it in. I thought of every night I'd laid awake, counting the boards overhead, telling myself there was no way out. And now, here was a door, narrow and dangerous, but open. She reached across the table and took my hand. Her skin was warm, her grip surprisingly strong. "I can't do it alone," I whispered. "You won't have to." Her words settled into me like a promise. For the first time in years, I felt the smallest flicker of relief. We made no plans that day, just the acknowledgement that there would be plans. That alone was enough to steady me when I slipped back through the yard, every step watched by the windows I'd spent my life behind. That evening, I kept to myself. I moved quietly through the rooms, careful not to draw his attention. But when night fell, and I lay in the dark, I let my mind drift to a different vision. I pictured a road stretching away from this town, lined with tall pines and pale sky. I imagined walking it with no one calling me back, no hand dragging me down. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that I might get there. That somewhere beyond Old Hollow, there was a place where my name belonged only to me. I didn't know yet that hope, once you let it in, is impossible to bury again. Even when you're terrified, it insists on growing. That night, before I drifted into a restless sleep, I pressed the butterfly clip against my palm. The little tin wings were cool against my skin, a reminder that something fragile can survive if you protect it fiercely enough. And I promised myself, in a voice no one could hear, that I would not die in that house. The days that followed moved with a strange hush, as if the house itself was listening for any misstep. My foster father kept to his habits, but I sensed a tautness in the way he watched me, a wariness I had never seen before. He knew something was shifting, though maybe he couldn't name it. Each morning, I rose before dawn and moved through my chores as if nothing inside me had changed. I cooked his breakfast, scrubbed the floors, split kindling for the stove. My hands remembered the motions, but my mind was elsewhere, already stepping past the door, already tasting air that didn't carry his shadow. When I dared to look out the window, the trees seemed different, taller somehow, as if they were waiting too. I found comfort in that thought, that even silent things could be witnesses. One evening, just after supper, he sat in his usual chair by the fire. The lamplight flickered over his face, hollowing the lines around his mouth. He watched me clear the table, his gaze fixed, as if he was searching for the girl who used to flinch at every word. "You've been quiet lately," he said. I kept my eyes on the plate in my hands. It was easier not to meet his stare. "Have you forgotten how much you owe me?" he asked, his voice soft in a way that made my stomach clench. "No," I said, though the lie burned my tongue. He nodded, as if satisfied, and leaned back in his chair. But his eyes didn't leave me, and I felt them long after I'd retreated to the kitchen. That night, I lay on my pallet and watched the ceiling for hours. The darkness seemed deeper than usual, pressing against my skin. My heart thudded slow and heavy, each beat echoing the truth I couldn't ignore anymore. It would not be enough just to wish for escape. I would have to take it. The next afternoon, when he left to haul lumber from town, I ran across the yard to Mrs. Porter's. She met me at the door before I could knock, as if she'd been listening for my steps. "Come inside," she murmured. "You look like you're carrying the whole world on your back." We sat at her kitchen table again. The same wooden chairs, the same checked cloth, but this time, there was something different in the air, something that felt almost like resolve. "I can't stay much longer," I said, my voice hoarse. "I know," she replied. Her eyes were steady on mine. "And you won't." She told me she'd spoken to her nephew in Asheville, that he could drive me away if I was brave enough to meet him in town. My breath caught, dizzy with possibility. "When?" I asked. "Soon," she said. "Before the first snow." The words sank into me, warm and frightening. Soon. We talked in hushed tones, as if the walls themselves might carry tales back across the yard. She pressed a folded scrap of cloth into my hand before I left. Inside was a small piece of paper. "If you need me in a hurry," she said, "hang this white rag on your line." "I'll come." I nodded, unable to find words. As I stepped back out into the cold, the wind hit my face so sharply it felt like waking from a dream. That night, I tucked the cloth beneath my pillow with the butterfly clip, 2 small tokens, both of them proof that someone in this world cared whether I lived or died. The next days passed with a trembling slowness. I moved carefully through each hour, afraid he might see the shift in my gaze, the steadier way I held myself. I told myself over and over not to falter. But one morning, as I was kneading dough, he came up behind me without a sound. His hand landed on my shoulder so suddenly I nearly dropped the bowl. "What are you thinking about all the time?" he asked. His breath was hot against my neck. "Just the bread," I lied, voice as even as I could make it. He stood there a long moment before he stepped back. But when I turned to look, he was still watching me, suspicion darkening his eyes. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I listened to the boards creak as he moved through the house. My chest ached with fear and something else seen impatience I couldn't smother. In the dim hours before dawn, I decided it was time to act. I would not wait for the first snow. I would not wait for him to decide whether I deserved freedom. At midday, when he left again for the sawmill, I crossed the yard to Mrs. Porter's, heart battering my ribs. She saw my face and didn't ask a single question. "I'm ready," I said. She nodded, her hands trembling just a little. "Then let's make the plan." We sat together, heads bent over the oilcloth table, and mapped out every step. Where I'd meet her nephew. What I'd carry. How I'd leave the back door unlatched, so I wouldn't fumble with the lock. When it was done, I felt a stillness settle inside me. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was the first time I'd felt I belonged to myself more than I belonged to him. I slipped back into the house before sunset, heart thumping wild and alive. In the kitchen, the kettle whistled on the stove. I reached for the butterfly clip and closed my fingers around it. No matter what waited on the other side of that door, I knew I would never again surrender to the dark without a fight. The day we set for my escape began like any other, which made it feel almost unbearable in its ordinariness. I rose before the dawn bell, hands already cold, heart steady in a way that startled me. It was as though the fear had folded itself into a quiet determination that left no room for trembling. I made breakfast as usual, moving slowly so nothing in my manner would give me away. He sat at the table with the newspaper, turning the pages without looking up. I watched his knuckles as they gripped the edges, the same hands that had built the walls of this house, the same hands that had held me down. When he finally spoke, it was in that soft voice I'd come to dread. "Going to be gone a while today," he said, eyes still lowered, lot to haul before the cold sets in. I nodded, pressing a crust of bread to my lips though I couldn't swallow. All I could think was that by sundown, if luck didn't abandon me, I'd be free of this place. He rose and pulled on his coat. His gaze flicked over me, searching for something I didn't dare show. When he reached the door, he paused. "Be here when I get back," he murmured. I only nodded again, not trusting my voice. The truck engine rattled to life, and then faded down the road. When the sound was gone, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Every moment after felt wrapped in gauze, too bright and too quiet. I moved through the house with careful purpose, gathering the few things I would carry, a change of clothes, the little tin clip, the folded rag from Mrs. Porter. I tucked them into a cloth sack and hid it behind the woodpile near the back door. I spent the afternoon waiting, too restless to sit. My thoughts drifted to the first night he'd crossed that threshold and become something I couldn't have imagined in my worst nightmares. I had been so small then, believing if I closed my eyes, I could disappear. But I hadn't disappeared. I had survived. And now, I would leave. The light began to thin across the yard. I stood by the window, watching the road for any trace of dust that might mean his return. The wind pressed against the panes with a low, steady sigh. When the last gleam of sun vanished behind the trees, I tied my shawl around my shoulders and slipped out the back door. My sack felt too light in my hand for all that it carried. Mrs. Porter was waiting at the fence, her scarf pulled tight under her chin. She didn't say anything, only reached for my arm. I let her lead me across the yard, each step loosening the knot in my chest. Her nephew's truck waited at the far end of the lane, engine running low. The headlights were off, but the cab glowed softly with the dash light. I could see the outline of a young man in the driver's seat, hands resting on the wheel. "You ready?" she asked. I opened my mouth to answer, but all that came out was a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh. She squeezed my hand. "Then go," she whispered. "Don't look back." I climbed into the truck, pulling the door shut behind me. The young man Tom, she'd told Menadid once, his face serious but kind. He didn't ask any questions. He only shifted into gear and steered us down the lane. The tires crunched over gravel, carrying me away from the house that had been both prison and coffin. I couldn't help it, I turned to look. The windows glowed with lamplight. I wondered if he was inside already, if he'd noticed the back door ajar, the cold wind creeping through the kitchen. Tom glanced at me, then back to the road. "We'll be across the county line by midnight," he said. I pressed my hand to the window glass. The darkness outside seemed endless. But instead of fear, I felt something almost like relief. We didn't speak as the miles passed. My thoughts drifted in and out of memory faces I'd rather forget, the ache of nights too long to measure, but over it all was the simple truth that I was leaving. I repeated it to myself like a prayer. When we reached the old bridge that marked the boundary between one county and the next, Tom slowed and looked at me. "You sure you want to keep going?" he asked. "Yes," I said, voice steady. I've never been more sure. He nodded and pressed the accelerator. The truck rolled across the bridge. With each foot of distance, I felt the weight on my shoulders begin to lift. It didn't vanish all at once. The burden of those years would never disappear entirely. But I knew, with a clarity so sharp it made my chest ache, that I would never again belong to that house or the man who tried to make it my tomb. We drove on through the night, past fields that smelled of frost and wood smoke. I leaned my head against the cool glass, watching the stars shiver over the dark horizon. For the first time since I was a girl, I let myself think about the future. Not the day after tomorrow, or the week beyond that, but the long stretch of years I still might claim for myself. I didn't know yet where I would go or who I might become. But I knew I would find out. And that was enough. We reached Asheville before dawn, when the sky was still a deep gray and the streets lay hushed under a thin veil of frost. Tom parked near a narrow alley behind a row of old brick buildings. He turned off the engine and looked at me, his expression careful, as if he worried one wrong word might shatter whatever was holding me together. "You'll be safe here," he said. "My aunt's expecting you." I nodded, feeling the quiet in my chest spreading wider than fear. I clutched the little cloth sack to my ribs as I stepped out into the cold. The pavement was slick, and my breath floated white in the darkness. At the back door of the bakery, Tom knocked 3 times. After a moment, it swung open to reveal a woman with hair the same pale brown as his, though threaded with gray. She wore a flour-dusted apron and a tired kindness in her eyes. "You must be Clara," she said. "Come inside, child, let's warm you up." I followed her in, feeling the heat of the ovens rise up to meet me. The air smelled of yeast and cinnamon. For a moment, the simple sweetness was almost too much. I had lived so long with the sour stink of whiskey and fear that the clean, warm scent made my eyes sting. Tom gave his aunt a brief hug and stepped back. "You'll be all right now," he told me. "If you need anything, you can send word through Mrs. Porter." "Thank you," I said, my voice rough. He just nodded and left, boots tapping across the icy alley. The door clicked shut behind him, and I stood in that small kitchen, suddenly aware of how little I knew about the life I had chosen. The woman, her name was Ruth, gestured to a stool by the stove. "Sit, you look ready to fall down." I sank onto the seat, too weary to argue. She poured steaming milk into a chipped mug and set it before me. I wrapped my hands around the warmth, letting it seep into my frozen fingers. "You don't have to tell me anything," she said gently. "Not if you don't want to." I didn't speak for a long while. My thoughts were still back on the road, replaying every mile that had passed beneath the wheels. But when I looked into her face, I saw no pity there, only an understanding that loosened something tight inside me. "I left because I had to," I whispered. "That's all I can say right now." "That's enough," she replied. "You're here. That's what matters." The first light of morning crept through the small windows, glinting on the racks of cooling bread. I watched it in silence, my heartbeat slowing as the hours uncoiled. Ruth showed me to a tiny room upstairs, a cot by the window, a narrow dresser, and a quilt that smelled of lavender. I set my sack on the floor and sank down onto the mattress. The springs creaked under my weight, but it felt more like a bed than anything I had laid on in years. That day passed in a blur. I slept so hard and so long I woke disoriented, unsure whether I had dreamed my escape. But the sight of the little tin butterfly on the dresser steadied me. It was real. I was gone. Ruth didn't press me with questions. She let me sit in the kitchen while she worked, sometimes putting a cup of tea by my elbow without a word. Now and then, she'd glance over, checking that I hadn't slipped away inside myself. The nights were hardest. I would lie awake, the quilt pulled up to my chin, waiting for the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs, for the door to creak open. My body remembered too much. Even when I knew he couldn't find me here, the fear walked the hallways of my mind. One night, I woke from a dream so vivid my skin felt bruised. I had seen him standing at the foot of the bed, his face hidden in shadow. I sat up, gasping, my heart slamming against my ribs. It took a long time to realize it was only the dark, not him. I pressed the clip into my palm until the metal edges dug in, reminding me that I was here, in this room, alone. I repeated that to myself, over and over, until my pulse finally slowed. Weeks passed, measured in quiet mornings and long evenings by the fire. Slowly, the raw edges of my fear began to soften. I learned how to help in the bakery, kneading dough, wrapping loaves, sweeping flour from the corners. The work tired me in a good way, leaving no room for old ghosts. Ruth never asked what I'd left behind, but she did give me something I hadn't known I needed: a place where no one expected me to pretend. Sometimes, when I caught my reflection in the bakery's dusty window, I almost didn't recognize the girl looking back. She stood straighter, her eyes clearer. There were still nights she woke crying, but there were also mornings when she rose without dread. One afternoon, as I was carrying a tray of rolls to the front counter, a man came in with a sack of flour slung over his shoulder. He set it down with a thump and straightened, brushing flour from his sleeves. When he looked up, our gazes met. It was Eli. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. I hadn't let myself think of him often, had been too afraid that remembering would feel like wanting. But here he was, real and solid, his eyes full of questions I wasn't ready to answer. I set the tray down before my hands could betray my shaking. Neither of us spoke. The quiet stretched until Ruth appeared behind me, wiping her hands on her apron. "Clara," she said gently, "why don't you step out back for a moment? I'll finish here." I nodded, unable to find my voice. I pushed through the door into the cool dusk, leaning against the brick wall to steady my breathing. The air smelled of yeast and autumn leaves. My pulse thudded so loud I could hear it in my ears. He had found me, and though I didn't know what it meant, part of me felt like the last door had finally opened. I stayed outside longer than I meant to, the cool air washing over my face as if it might calm the storm inside me. My breath came in shallow bursts, and my hands wouldn't stop trembling no matter how I tried to steady them. I hadn't allowed myself to picture this moment. Thad told myself it was safer not to wonder whether Eli would look for me, or what I might feel if he did. But now that he was here, all my careful boundaries had slipped away, leaving nothing but raw, bewildering relief. The door creaked open behind me, and I turned, bracing for Ruth's quiet questions. But it wasn't Ruth who stepped out, it was Eli, the doorway framing him in the fading light. He held his cap in both hands, twisting the brim as if he wasn't sure he'd be welcome. "I'm sorry," he began, his voice low. "I didn't mean to startle you." "You didn't," I said, though it was only partly true. He looked at me then, really looked, and for a moment neither of us spoke. It struck me how much he had changed. There were deeper lines around his mouth, and something more guarded in his eyes. But he was still Eli, the first person who had ever seen me without judgment. "I didn't know you'd come this way," he said finally. "Ruth mentioned you were here when I delivered last week." I nodded, unable to think of anything to say that wouldn't betray the trembling in my chest. "I wanted to see if you were all right," he added, softer now. The words caught me off guard. No one had ever asked me that and meant it without expecting something in return. "I'm better," I managed. "Better than before." His shoulders eased, just enough that I knew he'd been carrying his own questions all this time. "Good," he said, "that's good." For a while, we stood there in the gathering dusk, neither of us willing to break the fragile peace. The wind stirred a curl of my hair across my cheek, and I brushed it back with a hand that still shook. "I never thought I'd see you again," I confessed, my voice smaller than I intended. "I almost didn't come," he admitted. "I wasn't sure if it would help or make it worse." "It helps," I whispered. He took a step closer, careful not to crowd me. In the silence, the sounds of the town drifted past: the clip of hooves on the cobblestones, the distant bark of a dog, all so ordinary it felt unreal. "I should get back to Ruth," I said after a moment, though I didn't move. "I know," he replied. "But if you need anything you just have to ask." "Thank you," I said, the words tasting heavier than they looked. He nodded, then turned and walked back through the door. I waited until I heard his footsteps fade before I let out the breath I'd been holding. When I finally rejoined Ruth inside, she didn't comment. She only slid a fresh loaf of bread across the counter and pressed my hand gently. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling's pale squares of moonlight. My thoughts moved in circles, brushing against memories I'd tried hard to bury. The nights when I'd prayed for someone to save me. The mornings when I'd wondered if I was invisible. And now, here was proof that I hadn't vanished. Someone had remembered. Someone still cared whether I survived. In the days that followed, Eli returned once more, delivering supplies and offering a quiet smile. We spoke little, but each time he left, I felt steadier, as if the hollow place inside me was filling by degrees. The work at the bakery became a refuge. I learned the rhythms of dough rising, the way heat turned raw flour into something sustaining. Ruth showed me how to braid loaves and how to mend the torn aprons. She never asked about the life I'd fled, and I never volunteered more than I could bear to say. One evening, after the ovens had cooled and the last customer had gone, I found myself sitting by the window with a cup of tea cooling in my palms. Ruth was tidying the shelves, her movements slow with fatigue. She paused and looked over at me, her expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way, Clara," she said. I didn't know how to answer. It felt too big a thing to agree or disagree. "It isn't weakness to be afraid," she went on, her voice soft. "It's only weakness if you let it keep you from living." I nodded, my throat tight. That night, I dreamed I was standing at the edge of a wide river. On the far bank, the old house waited, dark and silent. But this time, when I turned away, it didn't follow me. I walked along the shore until the water blurred into morning light. When I woke, I felt different. Not healed, some wounds never close all the way, but less tethered to what had been. The days kept moving. Winter crept in with cold that settled deep in my bones, but inside the bakery, there was always warmth. I learned to laugh again, though it startled me when it happened. Sometimes, when Eli brought a delivery, I even caught myself smiling before I could stop it. It was in those small moments, a shared joke, the quiet clink of cups being washed, that I started to believe life could be more than endurance. One afternoon, as I swept flour from the corners, Ruth pressed something into my hand. It was a small key, worn smooth by use. "It's for the upstairs storeroom," she said. "You can use it as a place of your own when you need quiet." "Thank you," I whispered, surprised by how much it meant. She patted my shoulder. "Everyone deserves a door they can close behind them," she said. Later, when I slipped the key into my apron pocket, I felt its weight like an anchor, a promise that I wasn't a prisoner anymore. As dusk settled over the rooftops, I stepped out into the street, breathing the crisp air. For the first time, I realized I wasn't afraid to be seen. And in that small, ordinary moment, I knew I had begun to reclaim something I'd thought was lost forever myself. Winter settled over the town in earnest, wrapping the rooftops in thick frost and making the bakery windows steam each morning. I learned to love the hush that came with snowfall, the way it softened every sound and made the world seem almost kind. Most days, I woke before dawn to stoke the ovens and shape dough while Ruth measured flour and watched me with that steady, quiet approval. My hands grew stronger, the small burns on my knuckles healing faster each time. There was a satisfaction in the work that I hadn't known I could feel, a sense that each loaf rising in the heat was proof I had survived something meant to break me. In the afternoons, when the last customer had gone, I often took my tea upstairs to the little storeroom Ruth had given me the key to. The narrow window overlooked the alley, where icicles hung like glass teeth from the eaves. I would sit there, the key warm in my palm, and let the silence sink into my bones. It was there, in that small square of stillness, that I began to write. Not long letters or confessions, only small scraps of memory, pressed onto the back of paper sacks with a blunt pencil. I didn't know why I did it, only that it felt necessary, as if naming the past made it a little less powerful. Some days, when my hand shook too badly to form the words, I would close my eyes and remind myself I was not in that house anymore. I was here, and he couldn't touch me. One evening, as I climbed the stairs to the storeroom, I found Eli waiting by the doorway. He held his cap in his hands, turning it slowly, his shoulders drawn tight. He stopped, my heart ticking faster. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said. "I know you probably don't want visitors." "It's all right," I murmured, though I wasn't sure it was. He hesitated, then looked up at me with eyes that held both caution and something I couldn't quite name. "I was wondering if you'd walk with me," he said, voice soft, "just around the block. It's been too long since we talked proper." For a moment, I considered saying no. The thought of stepping out into the open, where anyone might see us, made my stomach clench. But something in me was tired of hiding. I nodded, and his shoulders eased in quiet relief. We stepped into the cold together. The snow underfoot was packed hard, crunching with each step. I pulled my shawl tighter, feeling the warmth of Eli's presence beside me like a small, stubborn light. Neither of us spoke for the first stretch. We passed shuttered shops and dark windows, the only sounds the hush of snow and the occasional bark of a distant dog. When we reached the old church steps, Eli stopped and turned to face me. His breath came out in a cloud, and for a moment, he looked as uncertain as I felt. "I wanted to tell you," he began, "that I'm sorry I couldn't do more back then." "You did what you could," I said, surprised by how steady my voice was. "You helped me remember I wasn't alone. That was enough." He looked down at the snow between our boots. "I thought about coming for you sooner." "I did. But I didn't know if it would make things worse." "It might have," I admitted, "but maybe it would have helped too." His eyes lifted to mine, searching for anger or blame. I felt neither. Only a tired gratitude that he was here now, still willing to stand beside me. "I'm glad you came tonight," I said quietly. He exhaled, his breath visible in the cold. "Me too." We began walking again, slower this time. My heart no longer thudded in panic, only an unsteady curiosity about what might come next. When we reached the bakery door, he paused, one hand resting on the frame. "If you ever want to leave this place," he said, "you don't have to do it alone." I felt something in me loosen some last hidden knot of fear and I nodded. "Thank you," I whispered. Inside, Ruth was setting out the last loaves for morning. She didn't say anything when I came in, only met my eyes with a quiet question. I nodded once, and she returned to her work, as if that small gesture was all the explanation she needed. That night, I sat in my little storeroom with the lamp burning low. My hands were still cold from the walk, but I didn't mind. I thought of Eli's words, how gently he'd offered them, as if he knew too much to expect anything in return. I pulled out a scrap of paper and began to write again. But this time, I didn't write about the past. I wrote about the first time I had tasted a bread I'd made with my own hands, and how it felt to stand in the quiet, knowing no one could call me back into darkness. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Perhaps nothing would change. Perhaps everything would. But as I set down my pencil, I realized it was the first time I had looked forward without flinching. Outside, snow kept falling, erasing every old footprint in the alley. I watched it gather in drifts, soft and silent, and for once I felt no dread of what might come with morning. I had survived. And that, I was learning, could be enough to begin again. The snow kept falling through the long winter, burying the town in drifts so high the horses struggled to pass. Mornings began with the heavy scrape of shovels and the muffled voices of neighbors calling to each other across the whiteness. Inside the bakery, it felt as though we lived in a world apart, warm and scented with flour and spice. I grew to love the hush of dawn, when Ruth and I worked side by side without needing to speak. There was a rhythm to it that steadied my thoughts, as though my hands could remember peace even when my mind forgot. Sometimes Eli came by to deliver flour or help shovel the walk. He never stayed long. Never pressed me for answers I wasn't ready to give. But each time he appeared, the air seemed to ease a little, as if some hidden weight had been lifted. One afternoon, the snow had slowed to a fine drift. Ruth set a kettle on to boil and motioned for me to sit. "You've been here almost 3 months now," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was a question in it I couldn't quite name. I nodded, folding my hands in my lap. "I want you to know," she continued, "that you don't owe me anything. You don't have to stay out of gratitude." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to tell her how the thought of leaving made my chest ache in ways I hadn't expected. Another part still flinched at the idea of belonging anywhere. "I'm not ready to go," I said finally. She smiled, tired and kind. "I didn't think you were. I only wanted to be sure you knew it was your choice." That evening, after the ovens were banked and the storefront dark, I carried a fresh loaf upstairs to the storeroom. The little window was frosted over, but when I pressed my palm to the glass, I could see a faint glow of lamplight in the alley. It reminded me that the world went on outside this small safe place, that somewhere, the past I had fled might still be searching for me. I shivered, though the room was warm. For a moment, I let my mind trace old patterns, the shape of dread I'd carried for so long it had become a second skin. But then I thought of Ruth's steady hands shaping dough, of Eli standing quietly beside me, of my own voice saying I'm not ready to go. I was not that girl in the dark kitchen anymore. Even if I didn't yet know who I was becoming, I knew who I was no longer. The next morning, I woke before the lamps were lit, my heart beating with a purpose I didn't fully understand. I dressed quickly and slipped out into the alley. The cold shocked me awake, but I welcomed it. It felt honest. I walked without thinking, my boots crunching across packed snow. The streets were still and pale, each window shuttered against the dawn. When I reached the church at the far end of town, I stopped. I had no reason to be there, no prayer ready on my tongue. But something in me needed to stand in that place and feel the silence settle over my shoulders. I thought of all the nights I'd lain awake, whispering pleas to any God who might be listening. I wasn't sure if those prayers had ever been heard. But I was here, I had survived. Maybe that was enough of an answer. The door creaked behind me. I turned, half expecting Eli's familiar shape, but it was Ruth, her breath fogging in the cold. "You're up early," she said gently. "Couldn't sleep," I admitted. She didn't ask why. She only stood beside me, looking up at the steeple where snow was heaped in quiet drifts. "Sometimes," she said, "coming here helps me remember what I've already endured, and that surviving it once means I can survive again." I swallowed hard. I hadn't told her everything, but somehow she always seemed to understand. When we walked back together, the bakery windows were glowing. I felt a small ember of something like peace kindle inside me. Later that day, Eli returned with another delivery. He stood in the doorway, his cap in his hands, watching me with a careful expression. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "that you might like some fresh air when the snow breaks. There's a grove outside town used to go there in spring." I hesitated, the old reflex to hide tugging at me. But then I pictured the hush of that grove, the open space beyond any wall. "Maybe," I said. "Not yet. But maybe." His eyes warmed. "That's all right. Just say when." After he left, I found I couldn't stop smiling. It felt strange to let hope come so close without shutting the door on it. That night, I sat by the little window, the butterfly clip in my hand. I traced the metal edges and tried to imagine a life where I could wear it openly, without fear that someone would see it and ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. I didn't know how long it would take to get there. Maybe months. Maybe years. But for the first time, I believed the day would come. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft as breath. I watched it gather along the sill, and thought of Ruth's word show surviving once was proof I could survive again. When I finally lay down to sleep, I felt something I hadn't known in so long I almost didn't recognize it. It was the quiet certainty that whatever waited ahead, I would meet it standing on my own 2 feet. By the time spring began to thaw the last crusts of snow, I had almost started to believe I belonged in that small town. The days unfolded in quiet patterns, kneading bread at dawn, helping Ruth with the accounts, walking to the market when the air grew mild enough to soften the ice along the eaves. People began to recognize me. They nodded when I passed, their faces open in a way that still startled me. No one here knew the girl I had been, the girl who measured every movement to avoid a hand at her shoulder or a voice that could turn sharp without warning. One morning, Eli came by with a bundle of early Spriggs green shoots that smelled of damp earth and possibility. He laid them on the counter and smiled, his gaze flicking up to meet mine. "Thought you might want something alive to look at," he said. "Winter's been too long." "Thank you," I murmured, my fingers brushing the pale stems. He didn't linger. He never did. But that small gesture stayed with me long after he'd gone, as though the shoots themselves had taken root in the quiet space I was learning to trust. That afternoon, Ruth and I sat in the kitchen, shaping dough for the next morning's loaves. Sunlight spilled across the flour-dusted table, catching in her hair and softening the lines of her face. "I'm glad you stayed," she said suddenly, not looking up from her work. I hesitated, pressing the heel of my palm into the soft dough. "I didn't think I would," I admitted. For a long time, I couldn't imagine staying anywhere. Her hands stilled, and she lifted her eyes to mine. "That's how you know you've found a place worth holding," she said. When leaving isn't the first thing you think about anymore. I swallowed hard, not trusting my voice. That night, as I sat in the little storeroom with the window cracked open to let in the first warm breeze of the year, I realized she was right. I had stopped thinking of running as the only way to save myself. I had begun to imagine what it might be like to remain, to grow something lasting in the space I had carved out of fear. But change doesn't always arrive gently. Sometimes it comes with the quiet scrape of a letter slid under a door. It was early the next morning when I found it. A thin envelope, my name written in a hand I didn't recognize. My first thought was that it must be from Eli, though he'd never sent me a note before. I took it upstairs and sat on the edge of the cot, the paper trembling in my hands. For a long moment, I couldn't bring myself to open it. Some part of me already knew this letter was not a kindness. When I finally unfolded the single sheet, the words blurred before I could read them. I pressed my palm over my mouth, willing my heartbeat to slow. "I heard you found yourself a new little life," the letter began. "But you can't hide forever." My vision tunneled, the walls of the small room pressing in on me. I read the line again, then forced myself to the end. "I'll be coming to collect what's mine." I crushed the paper in my fist, fighting the old, familiar terror rising up my throat. The part of me that had learned to survive by staying silent tried to take over, whispering that I should burn the letter and pretend it had never come. But another voice, smaller but stronger, reminded me of the promise I'd made to myself in that truck on the night I left, that I would never again let him decide who I was. I took the letter downstairs. Ruth was folding towels behind the counter. When she looked up and saw my face, she didn't ask a single question. She only reached for my hand and led me into the kitchen. I laid the crumpled paper on the table. My breath came in shallow pulls, but I didn't look away as she read. When she finished, she closed her eyes for a moment. Then she smoothed the page flat, her fingers steady. "This doesn't mean he'll come," she said, "but it does mean we have to be ready if he does." I nodded, though part of me wanted to run to the door and keep running until my lungs gave out. "We'll go to the sheriff," she said. "I'll come with you." I swallowed. "He'll say it's a family matter. That it's not enough to act." "Maybe," she allowed. "But it's still worth telling." I wanted to argue, to insist it was hopeless, but when I looked into Ruth's face, I saw the same quiet resolve that had carried me this far. "All right," I whispered. That night, sleep didn't come. I sat at the window, the butterfly clip warm in my palm. I thought of the road I'd traveled to reach this place, all the nights I'd believed the past was stronger than my will to live. And now, though fear pressed close as ever, I felt something else too, an unwillingness to be forced back into silence. If he came, I would not be the girl who cowered behind locked doors. When dawn broke over the rooftops, I knew it was time to find my voice, no matter how long it had been buried. Morning came with a pale light that did nothing to warm my hands as I buttoned my coat. Ruth waited by the door, her face lined with worry she didn't bother to hide. Neither of us spoke as we stepped out into the street. The air carried the damp chill of early thaw, and our boots sank into patches of slush where the snow had finally begun to recede. We walked together toward the sheriff's office at the end of the square. I tried to hold my head high, though my chest felt tight enough to crack. Every step felt too loud, as if the whole town was watching me claim a story I'd never wanted to own. The sheriff was a broad man with tired eyes who looked up from his ledger when we entered. He nodded at Ruth, polite but distracted, then turned his attention to me. "Morning," he said. "What can I do for you ladies?" I forced my voice steady. "I need to report a threat." His brows drew together. "A threat from whom?" I handed him the letter, careful not to let my fingers shake. He read it once, then again, his mouth flattening into a thin line. "This your husband?" he asked finally. "No," I said. "My foster father." He nodded slowly, but I could see the doubt settling behind his eyes. "You got any proof he's nearby?" he asked. "Anyone seen him in town?" I shook my head. "Not yet." Ruth stepped closer. "Sheriff, you know her situation. You know what she came here to escape." "I do," he said. "But a letter's not the same as seeing him here. So you won't do anything?" I heard the tightness in my voice, the old panic pressing up my throat. He sighed, folding the paper carefully. "I can keep this on file," he said. "If he shows up, you come straight here, But until he makes a move, my hands are tied. I nodded, though every part of me felt raw with disappointment. Ruth thanked him with a stiff courtesy, then steered me back outside. We didn't speak as we crossed the square. My heart thudded with a sick rhythm that hadn't left me since I'd read those words, "You can't hide forever." Back at the bakery, I stripped off my coat and sat at the kitchen table. My fingers worried the seam of my apron, searching for something to hold on to. Ruth set a mug of tea in front of me and rested a hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "It's not your fault." "No," she agreed. "But it doesn't feel right, does it?" I shook my head, unable to answer. For the next hour, I tried to lose myself in small tasks, wiping the counters, sorting sacks of flour, kneading dough that felt heavy in my tired hands. But my mind kept circling back to the same thought. He could be anywhere, watching, waiting. I was so deep in that fear I didn't hear the door open until Ruth called my name. I turned, startled, to find Eli standing just inside, his face pale with worry. "Ruth told me," he said, voice low, "about the letter." I couldn't meet his eyes. I hated that he was seeing me like this, frightened, small. "I'm all right," I whispered, though it sounded unconvincing even to me. "You don't have to pretend," he said. "Not with me." His gentleness undid me more than any harsh word could have. I pressed a hand over my mouth, fighting the rush of shame and relief that tangled in my chest. He stepped closer but didn't touch me. I think that's what I respected most about Eli. He never took more space than I offered. "I won't let him hurt you again," he said simply. I wanted to believe him. I wanted it so badly my throat ached with it. That evening, after Eli had gone and Ruth had turned in for the night, I climbed to the storeroom and sat by the window. The sky was clear, pricked with stars that looked cold and unblinking. I remembered the first time I had thought about running. How impossible it had seemed, how dangerous, and yet, I had run. I had built something resembling a life from the rubble. But running had limits. Sooner or later, you had to stop, you had to stand your ground. I laid the butterfly clip on the sill, its metal wings glinting in the lamplight. I thought of all the names he'd called me: ungrateful, wicked, worthless. How long I'd believed them because no one else had ever said different. Now, I held on to other names: friend, worker, survivor. I didn't know when he would come. Maybe he never would. But if he did, I would not be the girl he left behind, cowering in the dark. I closed my eyes, let my breath settle. For the first time, I understood that courage wasn't a single moment of defiance. It was every quiet choice to keep living when the past tried to claim you. When I opened my eyes, I felt steadier. Not safe, not yet. But strong enough to face whatever came next. And maybe, I thought, that would be enough. The next days passed in an uneasy hush. I went about my work in the bakery, as though nothing had changed, but in truth, every step felt weighted with expectation. Each time the bell above the door rang, my stomach tightened. Every silhouette passing the window made my chest seize with a fear I couldn't reason away. Ruth never asked if I wanted to leave town. She seemed to understand without needing me to say it that running again wasn't what I wanted. Perhaps she knew that sooner or later, you had to stop letting fear dictate where you called home. Eli came by more often, always under some pretext: a delivery, an offer to mend the hinges on the back door, a question about supplies. He never stayed long enough to make it seem improper, but just knowing he was nearby calmed some restless place inside me. One afternoon, as I swept flour from the front steps, I noticed a folded scrap of paper tucked beneath the doorframe. My heart stumbled. For a moment, I couldn't move. Then I bent and picked it up, unfolding it with trembling fingers. "I haven't forgotten you." No name, no signature, but it didn't need one. I closed my eyes, feeling the cold spring wind creep under my collar. When I turned, Ruth was standing just behind me. She must have seen my face because she didn't ask. She only held out her hand. I passed her the note, unable to find words. Her mouth thinned. She folded the scrap carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket. "Come inside," she said gently. In the kitchen, she poured tea while I sat staring at my hands. They looked steady, but inside me everything felt fragile. "I can't keep pretending he won't come," I said at last. "No," she agreed softly. "You can't. We sat without speaking, the clock ticking in the corner. After a while, she laid her palm over mine. "You have a right to be here, Clara, a right to feel safe." I nodded, though I didn't feel brave, only tired. That evening, after the last loaves had been wrapped, Eli returned. He paused on the threshold, as if uncertain he'd be welcome. When he saw my face, something in his expression tightened. "Ruth told me," he said quietly. I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "You're not alone in this," he added. I wanted to tell him how much that meant, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I moved aside so he could step in out of the cold. We sat at the table while dusk gathered outside the windows. Eli wrapped his hands around a cup of coffee he didn't drink. The lamplight made his face look older, the lines at the corners of his eyes more pronounced. "If you want to leave, I'll help you," he said, "but if you stay, I'll stand with you." I looked up then, really looked. And for the first time, I believed him completely. "I don't want to run anymore," I said. He nodded once. "Then we won't." The days that followed were the strangest I'd ever lived, ordinary on the surface, but taut beneath. Customers came and went. Dough rose in the ovens. But beneath it all was the awareness that time was running on two tracks, the life I was trying to build, and the threat that might arrive any moment to shatter it. One morning, I went out early to collect kindling from the alley. The air smelled of damp earth and thaw. When I returned, I caught sight of movement across the square. A man standing near the church steps, his shoulders hunched as if against a wind no one else felt. I froze, my hands numb around the bundle of sticks. Even from that distance, I knew the shape of him. The way he held himself, watchful and bitter. He didn't look my way. Not then. He only stood there, head lowered. But I knew he would, eventually. I turned back inside and closed the door with care. My heart beat so hard it hurt. Ruth found me sitting at the kitchen table, the bundle of kindling forgotten on the floor. "You saw him," she guessed. I nodded, unable to force my voice around the truth. She drew in a slow breath. "Then we call the sheriff." Today. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt a hollow dread, as though naming the danger made it more real. But I didn't argue. I only rose and picked up the bundle from the floor. My hands were shaking, but I didn't try to hide it. By midday, the sheriff arrived. He listened without interruption as I described the man by the church. When I finished, he rubbed a hand over his jaw, looking older than I remembered. "If he's come this far," he said finally, "he won't leave without trying to see you." I swallowed, tasting fear and something harder beneath it. "What do I do?" I asked. "You stay here," he said. "I'll put a deputy outside until he moves on." After he left, the house felt quieter than ever. I sat near the stove, watching the flames catch on the logs. Eli arrived before supper. He didn't knock, only stepped inside and met my eyes. "I'm not letting him take you back there," he said simply. I knew he meant it, and for once, I didn't feel I had to be ashamed for needing help. That night, I lay awake on my narrow cot, listening to the sounds of the street below, the shift of wagon wheels, the creak of the bakery sign in the wind, and beneath it all, the hush of waiting. But even as fear curled around me, I pressed my palm to the hollow of my throat and reminded myself I was still here, I was still choosing. And no matter how the days ahead unfolded, that was a kind of power he could never take. The next morning broke pale and cold, the sky washed clean by a night wind that had rattled every loose shutter in town. I woke early, my mind already braced for whatever might come. When I dressed, I took care with each button and fold, as though preparing for a reckoning I could no longer postpone. When I went downstairs, Ruth was already in the kitchen. She stood at the counter kneading dough, her hands moving in steady circles. For a moment, I watched her, struck by how her calm seemed to fill the space around her. "He was there again at dawn," she said without looking up. The deputy spoke to him. "He walked off, but it won't be the last time." I nodded, my throat too tight for words. We worked in silence, the only sounds the creak of the oven door and the hollow thump of flour sifted into the bin. I thought of the man waiting somewhere in the streets outside, of the promise he'd made in that letter to come for me. There was a time when knowing he was near would have driven me to flee. Even now, some part of me longed to pack a bag, slip away before he could lay his hands on me again. But I had run once already, and I knew it wasn't enough to keep you free. Sooner or later you had to turn and face the thing that hunted you. By midday, the first customers began arriving, stamping snow from their boots and bringing with them the bright, ordinary chatter that felt both comforting and unreal. I wrapped loaves, made change, smiled when spoken to, but under every polite word, my heartbeat thrummed with that same question, when? It was nearly dusk when the bell above the door rang again. I turned, expecting another familiar face, but it wasn't. He stood there in the threshold, taller than I remembered, his hair threaded with more gray. For an instant, the bakery seemed to tilt around me. My breath caught. "Clara," he said. His voice was low, too gentle, the same tone he'd used all those years when he wanted me pliant. I felt the old terror press up against my ribs, but it didn't break me this time. "You need to leave," I said. My voice sounded thin, but it was my own. He stepped forward. The light caught the deep lines at the corners of his mouth. "I came all this way," he said, as though that should matter. As though it should excuse anything. Ruth moved from behind the counter and stood beside me. Her presence steadied my spine. "You're not welcome here," she told him evenly. He looked past her, his gaze fixed on me. "I raised you," he said, almost pleading. "You owe me enough to hear me out." I swallowed, my palms damp. "You lost the right to be heard the day you decided I was yours to ruin," I whispered. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, anger, then something like sorrow, but I didn't care what he felt. I cared that he was here, that he thought he could still reach me with the same old words. The door behind him opened again, and Eli stepped inside. His eyes swept the room, landing on the man in the doorway. He didn't say anything, just crossed the space until he was close enough that I could feel the warmth of him at my shoulder. "You should leave," Eli said, quiet but unflinching. My foster father's mouth curved in a humorless smile. "This isn't your affair," he said. "It is," Eli replied. "Because she's not alone anymore." A long silence followed. Outside, snow began falling again, soft as breath. I watched him take it in, Eli beside me, Ruth standing firm, the shelves lined with proof that I'd built something without him, that I'd lived. "You think this changes anything?" he asked finally, his voice rough. I met his gaze without flinching. "Everything changes when you stop being afraid," I said. He studied me, as though he could still find the girl he'd broken, but I wasn't there to be found. When he turned and stepped out into the snow, the bell above the door rang again, only a small sound, but it felt like the last note of a long, cruel song. The three of us stood in the hush that followed, the air bright with cold. Ruth laid a hand on my arm. "You did it," she murmured. I swallowed, my throat tight. Eli's hand found mine, warm and steady. "I don't know what will happen next," I said quietly. "You don't have to," he told me. "You only have to know you won't face it alone." The sky outside had deepened to blue, the snow swirling in slow circles around the lampposts. I felt something loosen in my chest, some tether that had held me in place for far too long. I didn't pretend I was healed. I knew how easily old wounds could split open, but standing there, I understood something I hadn't before. Survival wasn't just escaping, it was staying. It was looking the past in the face and refusing to cower. That night, I sat in my small room with the window cracked open to the hush of falling snow. I held the butterfly clip in my palm and closed my eyes. I wasn't the same girl who'd run in the dark with nothing but hope in her pocket. I was something harder now, something braver. And whatever came tomorrow, I knew I would meet it with my eyes open. The next morning dawned clean and cold, the snow piled high along the eaves, softening every sound. I woke to a hush so complete it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I didn't feel dread rising to meet me before I even opened my eyes. I dressed slowly, each movement unhurried, deliberate. There was a strangeness to that, quiet in my chest, as if my heart was learning how to exist without the constant anticipation of pain. I didn't know how long that feeling would last, but I let myself be grateful for it all the same. Downstairs, Ruth was tending the fire. She looked up when I entered, her face creased with something close to relief. "You slept?" she asked gently. "I did," I said, surprised to hear it spoken aloud. She only nodded, as though that was all she needed to know. We worked side by side through the morning, the hours unfolding in the familiar rhythms that had become their own kind of safety. The dough under my hands was warm and alive, proof that life continued, even when you were too weary to notice it. Around midday, Eli arrived with a crate of supplies. When he stepped inside, his eyes found mine first, searching for any sign that I'd changed my mind about staying. But there was nothing left in me that wanted to run. He set the crate down and pulled off his gloves. The three of us stood there in the small warmth of the kitchen, each of us carrying some private understanding of what had passed the night before. "You all right?" Eli asked, voice low. "I'm as all right as I know how to be," I said honestly. A flicker of something, maybe relief, maybe admiration, crossed his face. He nodded and began unpacking the crate without another word. Later that afternoon, when the last loaf had been sold and the shutters were drawn against the wind, I sat alone by the stove, feeling the exhaustion of the last weeks finally catch up to me. My hands rested in my lap, still dusted with flour. I thought of how long I'd measured my worth by the fear I carried, how I'd believed that surviving meant being silent, being small. But there was nothing quiet about the strength it had taken to look him in the eye and tell him he had no more claim on me. That evening, Ruth brought a pot of soup to the table and set 2 bowls before me. "Eli's staying for supper," she said simply. I didn't question it. It felt natural somehow, the three of us gathered at the table as the wind tapped at the windows. The lamplight painted soft shadows across Eli's face as he listened to Ruth recount small stories about the town, who had taken ill, whose child had started walking, who had plans to move west when the roads cleared. I watched him in the flicker of the lamp, realizing that the ache in my chest wasn't only relief, it was something tender I hadn't dared name yet. After supper, he stood to leave. At the door, he turned back, his hand resting on the frame. "I meant what I said," he told me. "If you ever need me, you only have to ask." "I will," I said, and this time, I didn't look away. When he was gone, the quiet returned, but it wasn't the same hush that used to make me feel trapped. It was something softer, like a house learning how to breathe again. That night, I climbed to the storeroom and opened the window just a crack. The air that came in was crisp with the promise of thaw. I stood there a long time, watching the snow melt in slow rivulets from the eaves, listening to the drip and hush as winter began to lose its hold. In that small space, I let myself imagine what spring might bring. Perhaps the days would stay simple: work, laughter in the kitchen, evenings spent with someone who never asked me to be anything but myself. Perhaps there would be more moments when I remembered how it felt to wake without dread. I didn't know if he would come back again to test my resolve. I didn't know if the sheriff's presence or Ruth's watchful care would be enough to keep him away forever. But I did know this: if he returned, he would find no place left for him here. As I turned away from the window, my gaze fell on the little butterfly clip resting on the shelf. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. For so long, it had been only a reminder of the night I first dreamed of freedom. But now, it felt like something more, a token of all the ways I'd chosen my own life, even when it cost me every ounce of courage I had. I set it back down carefully, feeling a strange steadiness bloom in my chest. When I finally lay down to sleep, the old fear was there at the edge of my thoughts, but it didn't consume me. I knew it would never disappear completely, but I also knew it didn't own me anymore. And for the first time, that was enough. The thaw came slowly that year, seeping into the town one pale morning at a time. I woke each day to the sound of snowmelt dripping from the eaves, mingling with the softer noises of a place returning to itself. The air still bit at my cheeks when I stepped out for kindling, but beneath the cold, something new was stirring. I learned to savor those early moments, breathing in the damp promise of earth waking up after too long under ice. Each sunrise seemed to remind me that nothing stayed frozen forever, not even the memories I'd carried so close they had almost hollowed me out. Ruth noticed it first: the way I moved through the bakery with less caution, the way I looked up when someone entered instead of bracing for the worst. She never remarked on it outright, but I caught the quiet pride in her eyes as she passed me the proofing baskets or showed me how to coax a loaf into the right shape. One afternoon, as we packed the last of the bread for the evening customers, she set her hand lightly on my shoulder. "I hope you know," she said, "that you've earned this peace." I didn't trust my voice, so I only nodded. But her words settled in me like warmth, reaching places I hadn't realized were still so cold. That evening, after the shutters were drawn and the ovens banked, I found myself standing by the window, watching dusk gather over the rooftops. The lamplighter passed with his pole, and one by one the glass globes flickered to life, spilling golden circles across the snow-specked street. I thought of the girl I'd been the first time I saw this town, the one who had stumbled off the back of Tom's truck with nothing but a small sack and a heart so tired it could hardly beat. I barely recognized her now, though I still felt her in the quietest hours, when memory reached out with cold hands. But more and more, she felt like someone I could comfort instead of someone I had to hide from. I didn't realize Eli had come until I heard the door close softly behind me. I turned, startled, but he only smiled in that calm, steady way he had. "I knocked," he said, "but you were somewhere else." "I'm sorry," I murmured. "Don't be. You looked peaceful." I wasn't sure what to say to that. It felt like a fragile compliment, something I didn't quite know how to accept. He stepped closer, hands in his pockets, and studied my face as if searching for the truth of how I was. "I was wondering," he said after a moment, "if you'd let me walk you to the grove tomorrow, the one I told you about." I hesitated, feeling the old wariness rise in my throat, but it didn't choke me the way it once might have. "All right," I said softly. "I think I'd like that." He nodded, as though he'd expected me to refuse, and seemed relieved when I didn't. We didn't speak much after that. He stayed only long enough to help Ruth carry in the last of the wood, then left with a promise to return in the morning. When the door closed behind him, I rested my palm over my heart, surprised to feel how calm it still was. The next dawn came early, the sun glancing off patches of snow that clung to the shady corners. I wrapped my shawl close as Eli and I set off down the lane. Neither of us filled the quiet with words, and I was grateful. There was something restful in his company, a sense that no explanation was needed. The grove lay just beyond the edge of town, a small stand of bare trees laced with new buds. The ground was damp, the scent of thawing leaves rising up with every step. We reached a low stone wall and paused. Eli leaned his shoulder against it, gazing out over the fields beyond. "I used to come here when I needed to remember things could grow back," he said finally. I looked at him, surprised by the softness in his voice. "Even after a hard winter," he went on, "everything starts again if you give it time." I didn't reply, but I let my gaze follow the slender shoots, pushing through the half-frozen earth, green against the brown. After a while, he straightened, his eyes meeting mine without flinching. "You don't have to answer now," he said. "But I'd like to see you more. Not just here, not just when something needs fixing." I felt my pulse flutter, not with fear but with something gentler. "I think I'd like that too," I said quietly. He nodded, his smile small but certain. We stood there a while longer, listening to the meltwater trickle through the moss. When we finally turned back toward town, I felt something ease in my chest, a hidden place that had never believed I could belong to anything good. That night, as I sat in my room with the window cracked to the sweet, damp air, I let myself think of a future that didn't end in flight. A future with mornings spent kneading dough, with evenings when someone's voice in the doorway felt like coming home. It was still a delicate hope, something I held carefully, as if too much wanting might scare it away. But it was real, and as I set the butterfly clip on the sill and watched the last snow dissolve under the stars, I knew I was ready to see what came next. Spring settled in with a quiet certainty. Each morning, I woke to the drip of snowmelt replaced by birdsong, the brittle cold softening into something I could breathe without bracing my shoulders first. It amazed me how quickly the town transformed, windows flung open, children chasing each other through puddles, the market stalls bright with early greens. I tried to let that change sink into me as well. I reminded myself that nothing in this world stayed the same forever, not even fear. One afternoon, Eli came by with a bundle of kindling and a basket of early rhubarb. He set them on the counter and lingered, his hands tucked awkwardly in his pockets. "I was wondering," he said after a moment, "if you'd come to supper on Sunday. My sister's visiting from Raleigh, and she's been asking to meet you." For a moment, my chest went tight the way it always did when anything felt too much like a claim. But when I looked at him steady, patient, I felt that fear ease into something softer. "I'd like that," I said, surprised by how true it felt. He smiled, relief plain in the way his shoulders lowered. "Good," he said. "You don't have to stay long." just come." When he left, Ruth gave me a look that was half amusement, half gentle caution. "You care for him," she said simply. I didn't pretend not to understand. I pressed my palm over my heart, feeling the quiet thrum there. "I do," I admitted. She nodded as though she'd already known. "Then let it be what it is," she told me. "You don't have to measure every kindness by the weight of your past." Her words stayed with me as I worked, following me even into the hush of evening when the shutters were drawn and the fire burned low. Sunday came bright and blustery, the sky swept clean by wind. I stood before the small mirror in my room, smoothing the fabric of my dress. It wasn't new, but it was the nicest thing Ionata's soft blue cotton Ruth had helped me mend. When I reached Eli's house, my hands trembled a little on the gate latch. But he met me at the door before I could lose my nerve, his expression open and unhurried. "I'm glad you came," he said, as if he could tell I'd nearly turned back twice on the walk over. Inside, the room smelled of roast chicken and warm bread. His sister, Marianne, greeted me with a kindness that didn't feel like pity. She asked nothing I couldn't bear to answer, speaking instead about her children and the garden she'd left behind to bloom without her. We ate together at a long wooden table. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like a person among other people instead of an intruder perched at the edge of things. After supper, Eli walked me partway home. The sky was streaked with late light, the air fresh with the scent of thawing fields. "Thank you," I said, though I wasn't sure how to gather everything I meant into so few words. "You don't owe me thanks," he replied, his voice quiet. We paused where the road forked toward the bakery. I thought he might try to take my hand, but he only looked at me, his gaze steady. "I want you to know," he said, "that no matter what you decide about any of this, I'm here. No expectations." I felt something loosen in me, a knot I hadn't even known was still there. "I know," I said, and it was the easiest truth I'd ever spoken. That night, I sat by the open window in my little room, the butterfly clip in my palm. The breeze stirred the hair at my neck, carrying the faintest trace of lilac from Ruth's garden below. I thought of all the ways I had tried to protect myself by staying silent, by staying small, and how it had taken so much longer to realize that protection wasn't the same as living. I didn't know where things with Eli would go, or how long this peace would hold. But for the first time, I was willing to believe that my life could be more than just a series of escapes. The next morning, when I came down to the bakery, Ruth was already kneading dough. She looked up, her brows lifting in quiet question. "I'm all right," I said before she could ask. She smiled, and we fell into the rhythm of work. The warmth of the ovens, the scent of yeast, the steady motion of hands shaping something good out of raw ingredients, it felt almost holy, the way it reclaimed me piece by piece. Later, when the last loaves had cooled, I slipped out to the back stoop. The sky was soft with clouds, but the air was warm enough that I didn't need my shawl. I tilted my face up, breathing deep. For the first time in so long, the past felt like something behind me, rather than something still waiting to swallow me whole. Maybe, I thought, that was all survival ever really meant, not the absence of fear, but the courage to step forward anyway. And as I sat there, hands folded in my lap, I let myself believe that I had finally begun. The first real warmth of spring came in a rush, soft rain falling through an afternoon that smelled of wet earth and fresh green shoots. I watched it through the bakery window while I wrapped loaves for the supper crowd, the sky turning a gentle silver that made me feel, for a moment, like the world had forgiven me for all the ways I'd once tried to disappear. Customers came and went, their coats damp and their voices bright with small talk. I realized, as I handed over parcels and made change, that I no longer braced every time the door opened. Some part of me had finally learned that not every arrival meant harm. When the last woman left, Ruth leaned against the counter and studied me with that quiet, thoughtful look she wore when she was deciding whether to speak. "You're different," she said finally. I set down the twine I'd been using to tie a bundle and glanced at her. "How so?" "You don't look over your shoulder anymore," she said. "You stand up straighter." I wasn't sure what to say. A part of me still felt fragile, afraid that claiming any progress would summon the past to prove me wrong. But Ruth only nodded, as if she understood the words I couldn't quite speak. That evening, Eli came by, his boots leaving small puddles across the threshold. He carried a parcel wrapped in brown paper and laid it on the table between us. "I thought you might need this," he said. When I peeled back the paper, I found a book of poems, simple verses about ordinary lives. For a moment, I couldn't speak. No one had ever given me something so gentle, so free of obligation. "Thank you," I said, and meant it more than he could know. He only shrugged, as though it was nothing, but I saw the way his eyes softened when they met mine. I walked him to the door. Rain spattered against the stoop, and the smell of it was clean and bright. He turned back just before stepping into the dusk. "If you ever want company when you read it," he said quietly, "you know where to find me." I nodded, my chest tightening in a way that didn't hurt. After he left, I carried the book upstairs and set it on the little table by the window. I sat there in the dim lamplight, turning the pages slowly. Each poem felt like a quiet reminder that a life could be made out of small things: fresh bread, warm rain, the space to choose who you let into your heart. I didn't read for long. The words were lovely, but my thoughts kept drifting to the way Eli had looked at me before he left, as though he could already see the person I was trying to become. That night, sleep came easier than it had in months. When I woke before dawn, I felt something in me was ready to unfold. The next day was Sunday. I washed my hair and wore the same blue dress I'd put on for supper at Eli's. The morning passed in a hush of work, kneading dough, tending the ovens, greeting neighbors who stopped by to share gossip and news. It wasn't until afternoon that I slipped out the back door, the book tucked under my arm. I hadn't planned to go, but sometimes the heart makes decisions before the mind can catch up. Eli's house sat at the end of a lane lined with lilac bushes, the blooms just beginning to open. When I knocked, he opened the door as though he'd been expecting me all along. "I thought we might sit outside," he said. We settled on the small porch, the book between us. I didn't read aloud, but I opened it so he could see the words if he wanted. Now and then, he asked about a line, and I tried to explain what it made me feel. Mostly, we just sat there, the afternoon light soft on our shoulders, the lilacs swaying in the breeze. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so close to peace. At some point, I realized I wasn't afraid of the quiet. I wasn't waiting for it to be broken by a voice I dreaded or a hand that would hurt me. The quiet itself had become something safe. When the sky began to deepen toward evening, Eli closed the book and looked at me. "You know," he said, "I don't need you to be anything but exactly as you are." The words landed in the hollow places I'd carried so long, and for once, they didn't echo. They settled. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked out over the lilac bushes, their scent drifting between us. "Thank you," I said finally. He nodded, and neither of us tried to fill the moment with more than that. When I walked home later, the air was full of the promise of rain, and the lamps were already glowing along the street. I felt the past trailing behind me like a shadow, but it didn't weigh as much as it used to. And for the first time, I allowed myself to wonder if the rest of my life could be something I built, not something I fled. That night, I set the book on my windowsill and left the pane open to the breeze. I lay down without dread pressing on my chest. The last thought I had before sleep took me was that maybe this was how healing began, it in great declarations, but in the quiet moments when you realized you had stopped looking for the door. The first real warmth of spring turned the streets to soft mud and coaxed the lilacs into full bloom. Each morning, I woke to the sound of sparrows in the eaves and the comforting hush of Ruth moving about the bakery below. It felt, in a way I still didn't fully trust, like a life I had chosen rather than one I'd stumbled into. I tried not to look too far ahead. It was enough to measure the days in small satisfactions: the clean heft of a loaf pulled from the oven, the scent of fresh yeast, the quiet company of Eli when he came by in the afternoons. One evening, after the last customer had left and Ruth had gone to see a neighbor who'd taken ill, I sat at the counter with my hands folded in my lap. The twilight pressed gently against the windows, soft and forgiving. For the first time in many months, I realized I was no longer waiting for something terrible to appear in that hush. I almost didn't hear the footsteps outside. They were measured, unhurried, the tread of someone who believed he had every right to be there. My chest tightened. Even before the bell over the door chimed, I knew. He stepped inside without looking around, as though the place belonged to him. His hair had gone fully gray since the last time I'd seen him. The lines at the corners of his mouth were deeper, but his eyes hadn't changed. I stayed where I was, though every instinct told me to bolt. My heart thudded so loud it felt like the sound might carry into the street. Clara, he said. His voice was low, almost patient. I didn't answer. I watched him the way you watch a snake you know can strike without warning. I came to see you, he said, that's all. I swallowed, tasting something metallic at the back of my tongue. There's nothing you can say that I want to hear, I told him, my voice shaking but clear. He stepped closer, and my hands clenched in my lap. You think you're better than me now, he murmured. You think you can just walk away from everything I did for you. I held his gaze. I'm not better, but I am free. He laughed then, a small, cold sound that made my skin prickle. You'll never be free, Clara. You can pretend all you like, but you'll always be what I made you. His words slid over me like oil, but they didn't stick the way they once had. Maybe, I said quietly, but you don't get to decide who I am anymore. He opened his mouth to answer, but the door swung wide, and Eli stepped in. He took in the scene in a single glance. The way my shoulders were set, the way the man in front of me leaned just a little too close. Eli didn't say a word, he only moved to stand at my side. Not between us, just beside me. It felt like the most powerful thing he could have done. My father's mouth thinned. He looked at Eli, then back at me, and something in his eyes faltered. You think this is over, he said finally. But you can't erase me. I didn't look away. I didn't shrink. I'm not trying to erase you, I told him. You'll always be part of my story, but you don't get to be the ending. A long moment passed. The only sound was the soft tick of the clock on the shelf. At last, he seemed to deflate, his shoulders curving in on themselves. Without another word, he turned and walked back out into the evening. The bell above the door chimed once, then stilled. I waited until I couldn't see him anymore before I let my breath go. My legs felt unsteady, but I stayed upright. Eli's hand came to rest gently at my elbow. He didn't ask if I was all right. He didn't need to. After a time, I turned to him. Thank you for not speaking for me, I said. His eyes were steady. You didn't need me to. We stood there a while longer, the last of the day fading beyond the window. When I finally sat, it wasn't from weakness, but from the pure exhaustion of holding myself so fiercely upright. Ruth returned just before dark. When she saw the set of my face, the way Eli's hand still rested near mine, she understood without asking. You did what you had to do, she murmured as she brushed a stray crumb from the counter. I nodded, and for the first time, there was no shame in the acknowledgement. That night, I climbed the narrow stairs to my room and opened the window wide. The air smelled of thawed earth and lilacs. I thought of all the years I'd spent waiting for someone else to decide my worth. No more, I whispered into the darkness. I turned back to the room, to the small blue dress folded at the foot of the bed, to the book of poems waiting on the table. Each thing felt like a piece of a life that belonged only to me. And though fear still lingered at the edge of my thoughts, it no longer ruled them. I lay down in the hush that followed, my hand resting over my heart, and knew without question that I had finally claimed something no one could take. When I finally rose and dressed, I felt a heaviness behind my ribs, but it wasn't dread, it was something quieter, a tiredness earned by facing what I'd spent years running from. Ruth looked up when I came down. She didn't ask how I felt, she only poured a cup of coffee and set it before me. I was grateful for that. Words would have been too brittle. We worked side by side through the morning. As the ovens warmed, and the dough rose under our palms, I felt a slow ease returning to my body. The memory of him standing in the doorway was still fresh, but it no longer had the power to hollow me out. Around midday, Eli appeared. He knocked this time, a small courtesy that made my throat tighten. When he stepped inside, he seemed more hesitant than usual, as though unsure if his presence would be welcome after the night before. I'm heading up toward the ridge this afternoon, he said quietly. Thought you might want to walk a little ways. I met his gaze and searched myself for fear. It wasn't there. Only a cautious curiosity about what it would feel like to say yes. All right, I said. I think I would. Ruth nodded, her approval unspoken but clear. We left the bakery just past noon, the road already warming under the first real sun of the season. The town fell away behind us as we climbed the gentle rise beyond the last fences, the path edged with wildflowers just beginning to uncurl their petals. We didn't talk much. Every so often, Eli pointed out a place where the creek flooded in spring, or where he'd once seen a fox slip through the underbrush. I listened, not because I needed to fill the silence, but because I liked the sound of his voice in the quiet air. At the top of the ridge, we stopped. The valley spread below us, in a patchwork of green fields and soft blue shadows. I drew in a breath that tasted of new grass and thawed soil. "You know," Eli said after a while, "I think you're braver than you believe." I didn't answer right away. The word brave felt too big for me, too heavy. But as I stood there, I realized it wasn't about feeling ready, it was about standing your ground even when your heart still wanted to run. "Maybe," I said finally, "being brave just means staying." His eyes warmed. "Maybe it does." We stood together, letting the wind pass over us. In that stillness, I understood something that had eluded me before. Healing wasn't a single moment of triumph. It was the simple choice to be present, to keep reaching for a life beyond the edges of your fear. On the way back down, Eli didn't try to take my hand. But when our shoulders brushed, I didn't pull away. The contact felt like a promise that neither of us needed to speak aloud. When we reached the bakery, the afternoon sun had slanted low across the rooftops. I turned to him before he could step away. "Thank you," I said, "not just for today, for not treating me like I was broken." "You were never broken," he said softly, "just hurt." His words settled into me, quiet and certain. That evening, as I folded towels in the warm kitchen, Ruth hummed under her breath. She moved around me with the ease of someone who had spent years making the same small rituals into something sturdy enough to hold a life. "You look lighter," she remarked when I set the last cloth in the cupboard. "I think I am," I said. She reached out and touched my cheek, a gesture so gentle it nearly undid me. "You earned that lightness," she told me. When night came, I climbed to my room and sat by the window. The lilacs had begun to open, their fragrance drifting up on the mild breeze. I let it fill my lungs, reminding me that each season brought its own small miracles. I didn't pretend everything was finished. There would be days when the old fear returned, as familiar as a bruise, but it no longer felt like the only thing that defined me. In the hush, I took the butterfly clip from the windowsill and held it against my heart. Once, it had been only a secret I clung to. Now, it was something simpler, a reminder that even the smallest token of kindness could light a path forward. I closed my eyes and listened to the night sounds beyond the glass, the rustle of branches, the faint call of an owl in the dark. And for the first time, I felt the stirrings of a hope that wasn't fragile, but quietly sure of itself. Whatever waited in the days ahead, I knew I wouldn't face it alone. And that knowing felt like the first true freedom I'd ever claimed. Morning came soft and golden, sliding across the floorboards in slow stripes. I lay in the quiet a long while, listening to the sparrows fuss in the eaves and the distant creak of Ruth's steps on the stairs. It was astonishing, still, how different the world looked without the constant shadow of fear pressing on my heart. I dressed and made my way to the kitchen, where Ruth was already shaping dough, her hands moving with the practiced grace I'd come to find comforting. She looked up as I entered, her gaze searching my face for any trace of what the night before might have left behind. "I'm all right," I said before she could ask. She nodded, satisfied, and we worked together in the hush that belonged only to early hours. Later that morning, when the sun had climbed high enough to warm the stoop, Eli arrived with a small crate of early greens. He paused in the doorway, his cap in his hands, as though waiting for me to decide whether I wanted him to stay. "I'm glad you're here," I told him. He smiled, slow and careful, and set the crate down by the counter. Ruth disappeared into the back to tend to inventory, leaving us alone in the warm, yeasty air. I wiped my hands on my apron and leaned against the work table. "I keep thinking," I said quietly, "that maybe this is what a life is supposed to feel like." His brow furrowed just a little. "What's that?" "Not always easy," I explained, "but not so heavy you can't breathe." Eli nodded as though he understood, and maybe he did. He had his own shadows he didn't often speak of. "You deserve that," he said, "more than most." The words settled into me, warm and steady. After he left, the day moved on in its familiar rhythm. Customers came and went, their voices bright with talk of gardens and new calves and the promise of longer days ahead. I listened with a strange tenderness, as though every ordinary exchange was proof I belonged here. In the quiet stretches between errands, I caught Ruth watching me with that same thoughtful expression. At first, I pretended not to notice, but by evening, I couldn't ignore it any longer. "What is it?" I asked, as I swept the last flower from the floor. She hesitated, then folded her hands over her apron. "I think you're ready," she said. "For what?" "To start thinking about what comes next." I frowned, unsure whether I felt more hopeful or afraid. "What if I don't know what that is?" She smiled, a little sadly. "Most people don't, but you won't figure it out standing still." I thought about that long after the lamps were turned down. In my room, I sat by the window, the butterfly clip resting in my palm. For so long, just surviving had been enough. It felt almost treacherous to wonder if there might be more. The next afternoon, Eli returned. He didn't bring supplies this time, only himself. We stood by the back door, the breeze carrying the scent of thawed soil and the first shy blossoms. "You ever think about going back?" he asked softly. "To the old house?" I shook my head. "Not there," he clarified. "Just back to see what's become of it all. To know it doesn't hold you anymore." I hadn't let myself consider it. The thought alone made my heart flutter in my chest. But standing there beside him, I realized I wasn't trembling. "Maybe," I said. "Someday. If you want," he began, his voice careful, "I'd go with you." I studied his face, the steady way he looked at me as if nothing I said could change how he felt. "I know you would," I said, and it was the simplest truth I'd ever spoken. That evening, I helped Ruth close the shop. We worked quietly, but the hush between us wasn't the same as before. It felt companionable, like the space between two people who had come through something together. When the lamps were doused and the door latched, I stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment. "Thank you," I said, though the words felt too small for all she had given me. She reached out and laid her palm against my cheek. "You don't owe me thanks, Clara. You gave me just as much." I didn't ask what she meant. Some things don't need explaining. That night, I lay in my narrow bed, the breeze lifting the curtain in slow sighs. I thought of the road that had brought me here, the running, the nights I'd prayed to disappear, the mornings I'd woken surprised to still be alive. I thought of Eli, patient and steadfast. Of Ruth, who never once looked at me with pity. And I thought of the small, persistent hope that had taken root in me, so quietly I hadn't noticed until it began to bloom. I didn't know what tomorrow would ask of me. But for the first time, I didn't feel the need to flinch from it. As I closed my eyes, I understood that healing wasn't a destination you arrived at, it was a practice, a way of standing in your own skin without apology. And maybe, I thought as I drifted into sleep, that was enough to begin again. Morning broke with a hush that felt almost sacred. I lay still in bed, listening to the breeze whisper through the eaves, and realized how long it had been since I woke with fear as my first thought. The quiet no longer meant danger lurking just beyond the walls. It was simply quiet, and I could meet it without bracing. I rose and dressed slowly, feeling the gentle ache in my shoulders from work the day before. When I came down to the kitchen, Ruth had already stoked the ovens. She turned and smiled, her face soft in the lamplight. "There's a calm in you lately," she said as she handed me a loaf to shape. "Maybe," I said, pressing my palms into the dough, "I'm learning how to let it stay." The morning passed in the familiar rhythm I had come to love. Customers drifted in, their faces bright with the promise of warmer weather. Children trailed after their mothers, tracking mud across the clean floor. Ruth only laughed and waved them on, as though she couldn't be bothered to mind. Near midday, Eli appeared in the doorway, a thin packet of letters in his hand. He looked different in the spring lightless, like someone who carried old griefs, and more like a man who had made peace with them. "Got these at the post," he said, offering them to me. "One's got your name on it." I hesitated, my heart giving a small, surprised flutter. It was rare enough for anyone to write to me. But when I took the envelope and turned it over, I recognized the careful script. It was from Tom, the nephew of Mrs. Porter, who had driven me away from the only home I'd ever known. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. The letter was short, plain in its kindness. He wrote to tell me that Mrs. Porter had passed quietly the week before, in the early hours before dawn. She had been buried under the big oak behind her house, as she'd always wished. I read it twice, then set it carefully on the counter. My throat felt tight, but not in the way it once would have. Ruth came to stand beside me, her hand warm at the small of my back. "I'm sorry," she said gently. She was the first person who saw me, I whispered, who knew the truth and didn't look away. "Then she gave you the start you needed," Ruth said. "That's a kind of grace." I nodded, swallowing the ache. After the last customer left, I walked to the stoop to clear my head. The sky had turned pale and soft, the air scented with damp earth. Eli joined me, leaning his shoulder against the doorframe. "I didn't know her well," he said, "but I remember the way she watched out for you, like it was the most natural thing in the world." "It was," I said, "at least for her." He glanced down at me, his gaze steady. "You ever think about going back? To see the house, I mean." I didn't answer right away. The thought made my chest tighten, but it didn't feel like suffocating. It felt like something I might be strong enough to face. "Maybe," I said softly. "Not to reclaim it. Just to prove it can't claim me anymore." "I'd go with you," he said, "only if you asked." I reached out and touched his hand where it rested against the doorframe. The gesture felt impossibly brave and impossibly simple all at once. "I know," I said. That evening, after supper, I sat in my room with the letter spread across my knees. I traced the careful loops of Tom's handwriting and let the memories rise. Mrs. Porter's warm kitchen, her quiet voice, the way she had pressed a folded scrap of cloth into my palm that night and whispered, "You're worth saving." I closed my eyes and breathed through the ache of it. Grief was strange how it could come wrapped in gratitude. The next morning, I tucked the letter in the box where I kept my small, irreplaceable things, the butterfly clip, the bit of blue ribbon I'd once worn in my hair. And now this. When I came downstairs, Ruth was waiting with her coat already on. "You and I are taking the afternoon," she announced. "Where are we going?" "To the ridge," she said. "And maybe beyond." I started to protest, but she raised a hand. "Some places have to be seen in the daylight, Clara, even the ones that once hurt you." I hesitated, then nodded. We walked together up the winding road out of town, past the last picket fences and into the quiet open country. The wind tugged at my hair, and the hills rolled out in gentle green waves. When we reached the top, Ruth stood beside me and let her gaze drift across the horizon. "It doesn't look so big from here, does it?" she murmured. "No," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "It doesn't." We stayed there a long time, until the sun began to slope west and the shadows lengthened across the fields. When we turned back toward town, I felt lighter. Not because the past had vanished, but because it no longer felt like the only story I had to tell. And as we walked home, I understood that healing wasn't about forgetting, it was about seeing clearly and still choosing to move forward. The next days passed in a kind of quiet that felt different from any I'd known before. It wasn't the hush of dread or the brittle silence that comes from waiting for something to go wrong. It was a gentle space where I could finally hear my own thoughts without needing to flinch from them. Each morning, I rose before the sun and stood by the window, watching the light gather along the rooftops. There was a stillness in those hours that felt like a promise, a reminder that nothing in my life needed to be hurried anymore. Ruth noticed it too. She never said as much, but I caught her watching me sometimes with that soft, measuring look, as though she was trying to reconcile the woman standing before her with the girl who had once crept into this place half-broken and afraid to breathe too loudly. One afternoon, I stepped out behind the bakery to hang the laundry. The breeze carried the smell of warm earth and new grass. As I pinned the sheets to the line, I found myself humming without thinking. It startled me how natural it felt, how unself-conscious. When I turned, I saw Eli standing at the gate, his hands braced on the wood as if he'd been standing there a while. He was smiling, just a small curve at the corner of his mouth, but something in it made my heart lift in my chest. "I didn't know you could sing," he said. I flushed and shook my head. "I don't know that I can." Sounded like it to me. I smiled, feeling the warmth bloom all the way to my fingertips. He pushed the gate open and stepped closer. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The afternoon stretched around us, easy and unhurried. "You ever think about what you'd do if you weren't here?" he asked quietly. I took a breath, considering. I think about it sometimes, I admitted. But every time, I end up right back here in my mind. Eli nodded as if that made perfect sense. Then maybe that's your answer, he said. We didn't talk about it more. There was no need. Some truths were too simple to pick apart. Later, as the sun began to drop behind the bakery roof, I folded the dry sheets and carried them inside. Ruth was sweeping the flour from the corners. She looked up and studied my face for a long moment before she set her broom aside. You look like someone who finally believes she belongs, she said. I pressed the folded linen to my chest, feeling the truth of it settle in my bones. I do, I whispered. That night, I sat in my small room and watched the last of the daylight fade. I thought of all the places I'd carried inside me for so long: the dim kitchen of that old house, the road winding away in the dark, the borrowed room in Asheville where I'd first dared to hope. And then I thought of this place. The warm bakery, the soft clatter of Ruth's hands at work, the way Eli never asked more of me than I was ready to give. It struck me then that a life could be built not from what you escaped, but from what you chose to stay and nurture. The next morning, as I kneaded dough in the cool hush before dawn, Ruth spoke without looking up. I've been thinking, she said. You've learned this place as well as I have. You could run it yourself if you wanted. I stilled, my hands buried in the soft mound of dough. I don't know if I'm ready, I said slowly. Maybe not now, she agreed, but someday. The idea nestled in my chest, bright and frightening in equal measure. When the loaves were in the ovens, I stepped outside to clear my head. The first crocus blossoms had pushed through the last patches of frost, their pale petals trembling in the breeze. I crouched beside them, touching one gently with the tip of my finger. I thought of all the ways I'd been told who I was, what I could never be. I thought of the man who believed he'd shaped me into something too small to ever rise above what he'd done. And then I thought of how far I'd come simply by refusing to disappear. I didn't know if I'd ever be fully free of those old shadows, but as I stood in the warming light, I knew they were no longer the only story I had to tell. Inside, the bakery smelled of fresh bread and the sweet, rich promise of things made with care. Ruth moved around the kitchen in her quiet, efficient way. Eli would likely appear by mid-afternoon, leaning against the doorframe with that patient look I had come to recognize as his own way of saying he was here for as long as I needed. And me, I was here too. Awake in my life, claiming it inch by inch. When dusk came, I sat by the window and let the evening breeze lift the hair at my temples. For the first time in all my remembering, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was only breathing, and that was enough. The last days of spring arrived in a hush that felt almost fragile, as though the town itself was holding its breath. The crocus blooms multiplied along the fence line, and the air grew warm enough that we could leave the bakery windows propped open to let in the breeze. I moved through the mornings with a quiet steadiness that surprised me. For the first time, I felt sure in my steps. Sure in the way my voice didn't tremble when I greeted a stranger, in the way my hands no longer flinched at unexpected sounds. But even then, I knew peace was never a thing you could keep without effort. It slipped between your fingers if you looked away too long. It was a Tuesday when the letter came, a plain envelope, no return address, the ink smudged as if by a careless thumb. My heart kicked once in my chest when Ruth set it in my hands, but I told myself it was nothing, just an old bill or a note from someone who'd moved on. I waited until evening to open it. Waited until the ovens were dark and Ruth had gone upstairs. In the hush of the kitchen, I broke the seal with careful fingers. I didn't expect the words to feel so familiar, as though they'd been waiting for me all along. You can pretend you've escaped me, the letter read. But you carry me in everything you do. You always will. There was no name, no signature, but none was needed. I set the paper on the table and laid my hand flat over it. For a moment, the old panic tried to rise in me. The same cold certainty that I would never be anything but a girl in a dark house, waiting for someone to tell me who I was allowed to be. But then I thought of the bakery warm at dawn. Of Ruth's steady voice, Eli's patient hands, the crocuses blooming without asking permission. I thought of all the mornings I'd woken to find that fear was still there but that I was still here too. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the small box where I kept the other scraps of my life, not as a keepsake. As proof that I could look at it and still choose to keep breathing. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, listening to the wind move through the eaves. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine a future that didn't include him in any corner of it, but the truth came clear and simple. There would never be such a future. You don't ever get to be entirely rid of someone who made you. At dawn, I dressed and walked out into the garden behind the bakery. The grass was slick with dew, the air sweet and cold. I crouched by the fence and touched the crocuses, feeling how delicate their petals were, how easily bruised. And I wondered if there was any version of me that could be untouched by all that had come before. When I straightened, Eli was standing by the gate, watching me. He didn't speak, and I was grateful for that. Words felt too small for what I carried. After a moment, I lifted my gaze to meet his. He took a step closer, stopping just short of touching me. "Is it ever over?" I heard myself ask, though I hadn't meant to say the words out loud. He didn't pretend to have an answer. His eyes held mine, unflinching. "Maybe it isn't," he said, "but maybe that's not the point." I looked past him, to the road that led out of town. For a moment, I imagined setting out again, leaving this place behind like all the others, but the thought didn't settle in my chest the way it once had. It felt thin, exhausted. I turned back to Eli, feeling the weight of every choice that had led me here. "I don't know who I am without all of it," I admitted. "Then be the woman who survived it," he said softly, "the one who stayed." I closed my eyes, and for a single breath, I let myself feel everything: the sorrow, the gratitude, the bone-deep exhaustion of carrying so many lives inside one body. When I opened them, dawn was breaking over the rooftops, casting the town in a pale light that made everything look new. And yet, as I stood there, the letter still hidden in my pocket, I felt the smallest edge of dread curling in my belly. A reminder that some parts of you never stop waiting for the knock on the door, the voice in the dark. I didn't know if I would ever be free of it. I didn't know if I even believed freedom was the right word. But as Eli reached out, his hand resting lightly against my sleeve, I thought perhaps it didn't matter. Maybe survival was never about erasing the past. Maybe it was only about learning to stand in its shadow without bowing your head. And in that first thin light of morning, I knew I would never again mistake endurance for weakness. I would never again pretend the ache wasn't there. I would carry it, always. But this time, I would carry it on my own terms.